We have, oh, thank, thank you for getting the recording going. So poverty is complex. So we have two methods that we use for looking at low income. Today, we're going to be using the low income measure, which is a relative measure, and that is defined as 50% of the median family income, and it's adjusted for family size. And this report and the Campaign 2000's report uses something called the Census Family Low Income Measure after tax. And so it is looking at low income, doing the median again, but looking at it at the census family level. And uh, again, looking at being adjusted for after where their after tax income falls when it falls below 50% of the median. And so this calculation uses the disposable income after taxes. But you've also heard of the market basket measure, which we will not be going into detail today, but is used as the official measure of poverty by the federal government as part of their poverty reduction strategy. And that's an absolute measure that measures a family's disposable income to buy a basket of goods, including food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and other basic goods. And so it varies by family size, community size, and location across the country. I believe there's 52 or 53 different measures, and there is one for Hamilton. And so the challenge, of course, with the MBM has been criticized for underestimating the cost of some of these items like housing. So let's look a little bit at one of the things that we were looking at as we looked at what's been happening in our communities. You know, in 2016, the Canada Child Benefit was introduced that replaced previous child benefits and boosted incomes for low and middle income families with children. And it's the centerpiece of the federal government's initiative to reduce child poverty. And so this delivery through a tax system without reducing other benefits. And so this figure here shows that the child benefit is helping families across the income spectrum. And you can see that as that blue part of the bar at the top of each of these bars. And so for families receiving Ontario Works, their meager provincial income has been frozen since 2018. And so the child benefits impact and value is even larger now. That's making up almost half of the annual income for a family of four, as you can see in that leftmost bar. But it's not been enough to lift children out of poverty when their families are on OW, Ontario Works, or Ontario Disability Support Program due to the low provincial social assistance rates that haven't kept up with inflation. And so we also looked at what was the impact, because you'll see this in the data, and you've probably seen this in poverty data, that the impact of the temporary emergency response benefits that happened as a response to the pandemic, and the CERB benefit, added those earnings, but of course that was only for a short period of time, and you can see that again for the those you can see the threshold of the census family low income measure and its impact, and you can see where people, that it still had this slightly higher than than the previous median EI benefits and much higher than social assistance benefits, but again it was only a temporary measure. So child poverty in Hamilton for those children aged 0 to 17, you can see that we are in 2023 at 21%, or one in four children, or 1 in 5 children are in poverty. It's about 24,000, just over 24,000 children in Hamilton in poverty. And this would fill the TD Coliseum, which has an 18,000 seat capacity, and the Ron Joyce Stadium at McMaster University, which has about a 6,000 seat capacity. So that's many children in our community that are in poverty. And you can see that the impact that the child benefit had from 2016 on as the rate dropped to 2019. And then, of course, we see the impact in 2020, uh, where it fell quite a bit due to the temporary pandemic benefits, those one-time top up to this child benefit. And we saw it drop down to 14%. And then we saw that start to increase right after that. And so we're at that rate of 21.1%. And so this temporary measure really was only a temporary measure in its impact on child poverty in Hamilton. When we looked at some of the poverty rates in some of our surrounding municipalities, we can see that compared to Toronto, London, and Peel, we're a bit lower, but Toronto again has the highest child poverty rates, and in fact, today the Social Planning Toronto has released their child poverty report, and I'm sure you will see some of that information in the news, and maybe I don't know if Leila will talk to that later on, but we also see that we are higher in Hamilton than the Canada rate for child poverty at 18.3% and the Ontario rate, which is at 19.9%. And we are higher than some of our other neighboring communities like Niagara, Brant, Durham, Waterloo, and Hamilton. When looking at the child poverty rate by family type, lone parent families have been consistently higher than couple families. And the largest gap was in 2014, when there was about a 40% difference, as you can see in this chart. And it fell to the smallest gap in 2020, that year where those extra supports were in place, when it fell to about a 29% difference between couple families and lone parent families. But we see that the gap has increased once again, and the rise has happened more dramatically for lone parent families, where it's once again increased, where the gap between lone parent family child poverty and those in couple family is about a 37 percentage point difference. And so we see that nearly half of children in lone parent families are living in poverty, which is really a critical thing that we need to be looking at. Family poverty in Hamilton has risen in recent years. So when this graph is showing the number of families, the percentage of families that are in low poverty over the last number of years, and we can see about 14% of families, which is about just about 24,000 family units. And this mirrors the increase in child poverty and underscores the broader erosion of income security for households with children. When we look at depth of poverty, so this provides a critical insight into the severity of the financial hardship experienced by families living below these low-income thresholds. And it measures how far below the poverty line families falls, expressed as a dollar gap between the median after-tax income and the census family low-income measure poverty line. And as shown in this chart, between 2015 to 2019, we saw a little drop, but then a gradual rise to about 10,000, a gap of about 10,000, just over $10,000 in 2019. And this indicates that even as child poverty rates decline modestly due to the introduction and uptake of the child benefit, families who remain in poverty were experiencing those deeper economic hardship. In 2020, the depth of poverty temporarily declined to about $9,400, reflecting the effects of that pandemic era income supports. And after 2020, the depth of poverty rose sharply, as you can see, for 3 years in a row, reaching just over $11,000 in 2021, almost 13,000 in 2022, and now in 2023, just over 14,000. And in 2023, the depth of poverty had reached the highest level, with families more than just falling just over 14,000 below the poverty line on average. A sharp increase from earlier years, a clear sign that poverty reduction strategy at the federal level and programs are not meeting the needs of children. This chart shows the poverty gap as a measure of depth of poverty for 4 low-income family types in Hamilton. And so you can see we have lone parent family with 1 child in that first bar, couple with 1 child in the second bar, the lone parent with 2 children in the third bar, and a couple with 2 children in the last bar. And so we can see that the data shows a significant depth of poverty for all 4 family types, but lone parent families with 2 children have the highest poverty gap, with a median after-tax income that was almost $15,000 below the poverty line for a family of 3. So in terms of looking at where is this happening across our community, this map shows child poverty rate by census tract. Census tract is a geography that Statistics Canada use that is roughly a neighborhood of about 5,000 persons. And the extreme disparities in rates among the different geographic pockets of the city are visible, as you can see in this map. The areas of the map that are the darkest in color have the highest concentrations of child poverty in the city. Many of the census tracts with the highest rates of child poverty are in the lower city, both in the downtown core and extending into East Hamilton. So that gives us a sense of where this is also happening in the community. Finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the impacts of family and child poverty family and child poverty in Hamilton means those with inadequate incomes have difficulty meeting the daily requirements of living in the city. And so some of the impacts, and Leila and I will have a conversation, maybe unpacking these a little bit more after her presentation. But things like housing security, high rents mean families often spend a larger share of their income on housing, and this leaves less for essentials like food, childcare, and transportation. Food insecurity, again, access to, inadequate access to food really puts families in a really precarious position. And when households struggle to afford food, they are very likely struggling with other necessities, including housing, utilities, transportation, and clothing. Income security, low wages, and unstable work make it difficult for families to meet those living costs. And we know the living wage in Hamilton, as been calculated by the Ontario Living Wage Network. There's a gap even between that that was calculated in 2025 at $22.60 an hour. And it's about a $5 gap from the Ontario minimum wage of $17.60. And finally, community participation, belonging, and social inclusion. I think that's really critical to be talking about what does it mean what is the impact of family and child poverty on a household beyond meeting the basic needs. It also shapes how they can participate in community life and experience a sense of belonging. Participation and belonging can be, protective factors supporting resilience, social connection, and community well-being. So I am going to stop there with my presentation of some highlights from our report, and I will now hand it over to Leila to present her report at the national and provincial levels.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to focus
Okay.
mostly on the national level. I'm also going to just hope to get my share screen going properly here. From the beginning, and let me just see. Okay, does that look okay? Looks good. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
there. That's perfect. It looks good
Oh,
now.
okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to focus some of the data is the same data, but in the national context. I will not be talking at all about the Toronto report card that was just launched about an hour ago. But if you go to Social Planning Toronto's website, they have a similar webinar that they're going to be holding later in June. I believe it's June 22nd. So I'd really encourage folks to check that out and to get on their webinar as well. And the Ontario report card is forthcoming. So I'll have some Ontario data here, but we'll be releasing that later in the summer. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and sharing our work with our friends in Hamilton. So Campaign 2000, for those who are not familiar, is a pan-Canadian coalition of organizations like the Social Planning Councils, community-based, nonprofit, very diverse group of organizations from every province and territory coming together to advocate for ending child poverty. And we came about because the federal government promised, they passed a unanimous resolution in the House of Commons in 1989, and they promised to eradicate child poverty by the year 2000. We have been writing these report cards at the national level since 1991, talking about the state of child and family poverty and bringing forward community-driven, achievable policy solutions to what is a systemic issue. And we're backboned by Campaign 2000. And so that's kind of why I have that role with Family Service Toronto, is the backbone organization that ensures this work can continue. So I'm calling in from Toronto, the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations and the Chippewa. So Ted talked about the measurements already, so I won't get into the details of the two different measures, the market basket measure and the census family low income measure. I will only add that one of the drivers of the differences in poverty rates from the different measures is also the data that goes into calculating those measures. So the Canadian Income Survey, which is used to derive the market basket measure, is a relatively small survey that excludes populations that tend to have very high rates of poverty. So anybody in the territories, people living on First Nation reserves, anyone in congregate settings, institutions, jails, hospitals, foster care, those kinds of things, not counted in this survey. Really remote communities also not counted. While the low income measure, as Ted mentioned, is calculated with tax filer data. Anybody who's filed an income tax form, a personal income tax form, is counted, and that's the vast majority of the population. So the resulting difference, this is the national picture, this is the comparison between what you get from the market basket measure and the census family low income measure. So the market basket measure here, and there's a lag in all of the data. So we're looking at 2023 data, which is the most recent tax filer data. There has been an update since we've published to the market basket measure, but this is from 2023. And in 2023, according to the market basket measure, just over 10% of children in the country lived in poverty, represents just over 800,000 kids, compared to the relative low income measure, which shows a much higher rate of poverty, 18.3% of children, representing almost 1.4 million children living in relative poverty in Canada. And this is the third consecutive year of increases. So the trend, we are absolutely going in the wrong direction. The federal poverty reduction strategy, the federal government does not have a plan to stop this direction. And so we are really advocating for some new program implementations. And I'll get to some of our recommendations at the end. This is the census family low income measure from the year that we were supposed to have no child poverty. We actually had some of the highest levels of child poverty in the country, almost 1 in 4 children. And actually in 2024, it was 1 in 4 children living in poverty in Canada, with a very slow decline in poverty over the years until, similar to what Ted showed in Hamilton, 2016, the introduction of the Canada Child Benefit, 2017, some additional take-up, and so those numbers are reducing. And then during the pandemic years, that drop in child poverty happened across the country. We know that it was people who were precariously attached to the labor market, people with systemic barriers, Indigenous people, women, part-time workers, racialized workers tended to benefit from those pandemic response, emergency response benefits. And the poverty rate at the national level dropped significantly, but shot back up as those benefits expired and no substantive permanent program was put in place. So this is the national picture by province and territory. This is showing which provinces and territories are above the national rate. Those in that blue color and those in the orangey red are falling, provinces and territories falling below the national rate of 18.3%. We can see almost 20% in Ontario, but the highest rates in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, in the prairies and in the Atlantic provinces. And then we see lower rates in places like Quebec, where they've had a long-standing, affordable childcare program that it's a huge driver. This map also tells us the important role that the provinces and territories play in terms of poverty reduction with social assistance programs, wages, as Ted talked about, access to childcare. These are all programs that are housing delivered by the provinces and territories. So they also need to step up their game in our poverty reduction initiatives. We look at the rate of child poverty for children under 6. The trend is the same, but those rates tend to be slightly higher. And we look at this because there's lots of research that shows that children in the younger years, those early developmental years, the negative impacts are even more severe in those younger years. So we tend to take a look at those numbers as well, but we can see the same rates, except for in Nunavut, where it just skyrockets for those young kids. And our partners up there do tell us that this is an underrepresentation of what's actually happening in that part of our country. I will say that the data, none of this is a perfect reflection of poverty in the country, but it's an indicator. It gives us a sense of what is happening. The depth of poverty, I was really struck, Ted, by your chart and how quickly families in Hamilton were falling into deep poverty. Nationally, the depth is slightly higher, but my chart's not going up the same way yours did. That's a huge concern. That is such a shocking thing to see. This means families they have, in a time of an affordability crisis, families have much less money in their pockets to meet their basic needs. This is a huge concern. And even as the federal government has implemented their new poverty reduction strategy, which came into effect in 2018, and even as we saw some reduction in the rates of poverty, what they are not measuring is how deep those families in poverty are. What the Canada Child Benefit has done is taken people who are just $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 under the low income threshold, brought them slightly over, and left all of these families who are in deep poverty there. And that gap is growing. Similar, I won't spend a lot of time, but we have the same findings across the country with lone parents with 2 children falling significantly into deeper poverty, clearly because they have a lot less earning potential, more difficult access to childcare, and the flaws in our EI system for mothers with new babies. So, lone parents, mostly women, have very deep poverty, followed by lone parents with 2 children, and then couples with 2 children, and lone parents, couples with 1 child. This chart shows the number of children in low income, the percentage, and then the average low income gap ratio is another way of expressing that depth of poverty. And so what we're seeing here is, again, same trends, that lone parent families 4.5 times more likely than couple families to live in poverty across the country. What we also have here is this last line, children not in census families who are living in poverty. This is older kids, likely youth who are 16, 17, who are exiting the child welfare system, have left abusive households, do not have that family support, and they've likely walked into a social service, a homeless shelter, and the staff there have done intake and said, file your income tax form because you'll get some government benefits. And these kids are showing up in the tax file data, and almost all of them, 99% of them, are living in very deep poverty, more than 70% below that low income threshold. This is another really important indicator that's telling us our social um, our social infrastructure is really failing these young kids. So we need to be looking at and speaking to them and figuring out what programs and services and do we need to help close this huge gap that they're falling through. We look at also, we know in Canada that the way poverty is shaped by demographic, that Indigenous people, racialized people, new immigrants are facing higher barriers and their poverty rates are much higher. So the graph on the left-hand side of the screen is census data. We don't get a lot of disaggregated demographic data from the tax file. That's one of the flaws of that data. But we look to the census. So this is a bit old. We're expecting, the new census has just came out. We're expecting an update next year. But from 5 years ago, we can still see that there's a disproportionately high rate of child poverty for children living on First Nation reserve, First Nation children living off of reserve, Inuit children, Métis, and compared to non-Indigenous children. So on First Nation reserves in 2020, 37.4% of children were living in poverty, and that's compared to non-Indigenous children whose poverty rate was 10%. The graph on the right-hand side is from the tax file, and this is First Nation reserves across the provinces that have 5 or more First Nations. And you can see that number, 70% of children in First Nation reserves in Saskatchewan living in poverty. It's extraordinarily high, 63% in Manitoba. In Ontario, the number is 45.4%. So we've got really high rates of child poverty for children on First Nation reserve. This is census data, again, looking at child poverty rates for immigrant children. That's on the left-hand side, and we can see newly arrived families that are newly arrived have higher rates of child poverty, almost 22% of those children. And then on the right-hand side, racialized groups that the census releases. So Arab children, Korean, West Asian, Latin American, Black, Chinese, they all have much higher rates of poverty. Again, this is because of the discrimination and the barriers that these families are facing as they're entering Canada, as they're trying to enter the labor market, access social services, etc. We look at the effects of government transfers, including the Canada Child Benefit, on rates of child poverty. We do advocate for better government transfers because when we look at child poverty rates by market income, so market income is primarily employment income, but it will also include income gained from investments and capital gains. That alone is not sufficient to reduce child poverty. And in fact, the child poverty rate for children under 18 jumps to 30%, and just slightly more than that for children under 6. So if we did not have the Canada Child Benefit, the child poverty rate would have been 27% for children under 6 and 26% for children under 18. So the Canada Child Benefit really is, and government transfers as a whole are really doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of reducing child poverty. And we've been tracking this rate of this effect of the Canada Child Benefit since its implementation. And it's losing its power to reduce child poverty year over year, except for in 2021, where there was an additional supplement during the pandemic years, a young child supplement top up to the Canada Child Benefit. But we can see each year there's a slightly less reduction in the numbers of children living in poverty. So this may be my last, this is my last slide, and then I'll just very quickly go through some of our recommendations, but we do have recommendations around bolstering that Canada Child Benefit. The last data point I'll just highlight is as children and families are falling into deeper poverty, we are looking at the average incomes of families across the deciles, so 10%, 10%, those in the top 10%, their incomes, their average incomes are increasing. And in fact, they're making more than 19 times more what the bottom decile families with children are making. So this graph is showing the widening income inequality between families with children. Those in the top decile are earning on average $286,000 a year compared to families with children in the bottom decile whose average income is about $15,000 a year. So that gap is growing, and wealth and income is really concentrating at the top. So very quickly, we advocate for some legislative changes, including bolstering the Poverty Reduction Strategy Act, expediting targets, and ensuring those targets are applicable to those groups that have higher rates of poverty, those marginalized groups. And I'll flag that right now there is a members bill, a private members bill that has passed through the Senate that is making its way through the House of Commons to develop a national strategy for children and youth that would explicitly finish the job of eradicating child poverty. And so we're asking folks, call your MP, call your member of parliament, and encourage them to quickly vote for and pass that bill. It's a really good opportunity that's open right now. On the Canada Child Benefit, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has modeled a supplement to the Canada Child Benefit for those families falling into low income that would, in its first year of implementation, cut child poverty in half for some of those most marginalized families. We are also advocating for broadening out the Canada Child Benefit. Right now, families with precarious immigration status who are residents under the Income Tax Act but are not residents under the Immigration Act are not eligible for the Canada Child Benefit. And children in kinship care, informal care arrangements, there's a lot of red tape for those families to prove that they're caring for these children. And so they're having a lot of trouble accessing the Canada Child Benefit. So we're asking to remove some of that red tape and just make that administrative process quicker. And then we have additional recommendations around income security and fair taxation. I feel like I'm really at my time, so I won't go more into this. We might talk more about this in some of our conversation. And then, of course, we have a number of recommendations around bolstering public services, including access to childcare, adequate housing, and lifting up the minimum wage. And that's everything for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you. That it's sobering when we look at the data that both from the national report and our local report, it's sobering. So when we talk about child poverty, what does this mean in the day-to-day lives of children and families? What's your response to that?
Well, we talk to these families all the time. We're hearing from families, both through our work at Family Service Toronto, where we, programs for people with developmental disabilities, families that have experienced gender-based violence, and families who have mental health needs. And I'm saying that because families are struggling every day to, make those difficult decisions of, can I put food on the table today, or am I going to cut back and pay my rent, and maybe sometimes the calculation is, well, I paid rent last month, so I'll maybe go into arrears this month and buy some food or some medication. We hear these kinds of stories all the time, impossible decisions that no family especially in a country like Canada, should have to be making. And that increases, levels of stress and anxiety for parents, but also for those kids. And then when there are added concerns around, there maybe there's violence in the home, or you have a disability and you need additional supports, you need respite care, like, there is just so much that families are navigating right now. And again, like I said earlier, those cracks in our system are just, they're getting too wide. And organizations like Family Service Toronto, we don't have the resources to continually be meeting these needs. It's really challenging time for those families and for service providers who are trying to close these huge gaps.
Yeah, and we're seeing the same thing here in Hamilton as well. With some of the programs that we participate in, we're seeing the same stories. Family, especially many newcomer families that are just trying. Again, it's that navigation of systems, um, trying to make ends meet, and having to things like housing. We've seen housing prices, rental rates increase significantly. The lack of affordable housing options. We've actually in Hamilton, it's been documented that we've lost well over 100,000 affordable units over the last decade and a half, and those aren't going to be coming back. And so you have families making again those difficult decisions, and then trying to access those supports that they need for their children. If there's any challenges, around disabilities. I definitely have heard about that in terms of accessing the right supports, or even looking for any equipment. Those kinds of pieces. Like it's just really difficult. So what are the risks for communities of child poverty rise over the coming decades? I mean, we've seen this, both of us have seen both in our national report and our local report, and we've seen this, I think it's also reflected in the Toronto report that's come out, this pretty significant an increase over the last 3 years. And if
Mhm.
this continues, like what's this going to mean for our communities?
It's putting a strain on all of our resources. And I think there's a couple of things happening because in the province right now, we're seeing, there's not enough investments in our systems. I think about the education system right now and what's happening there. This is a place where kids are going and not getting the kinds of supports they need, putting a strain on, I live downtown, and I just remember the social worker at my kids' school started off with she rotated between two schools, and then she rotated between three, and then she rotated between five, and then she was rotating between all the schools in our ward. And you have one person who's trying to respond to all the children in a ward with any kind of complexity in their lives. It's a strain on all of our education system, our health services, all kinds of places. But like I said too in my presentation, this is a cycle, and even a small duration of time, even if kids are living in poverty for a year and then coming out of it, research has shown that there is ongoing long-term effects on health, on mental health, on educational outcomes, on the ability to attain good work. Like there are so many knock-on effects. We are all going to pay for that. So I think the effects on our communities are great in that way. And I think when we invest in families and in our neighborhoods and in our communities and in our social services, the effects of that, the positive effects of that are, we all benefit from that, right? To me, can I say it's a bit of a no-brainer? Like sometimes I don't understand like with decision makers, to looking at the data that you're putting out, that we're putting out, it just is so plain. We're using government data. This is not stuff we're making up. To me, it's just so plain. The evidence is so clear. The research is so clear. I know people around this table have been doing this advocacy work for so long, that it astounds me that we are not doing better.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, yeah, I think as someone that's worked in the field for quite a number of years and not seeing this changed dramatically. I mean, outside of our blip year of 2020, we've not seen any real progress in our communities. And and it's troubling as we've seen in both of our reports. It's troubling that the last 3 years have seen this, unwelcome trajectory in the increase in the depth of poverty that we also saw. Not just an increase in the rate and the numbers, but also in the depth. And so, what does this mean? And I think I talked a little bit about this before. About community participation and belonging. It's and in that social inclusion element, I think is so critical for the well-being of families and children in their communities. When children can't participate in arts programs and rec programs, sports programs, like how, can't if families can't afford school trips, or all those
Yeah.
elements that are part and parcel of the development of our children. What is that long-term impact going to be? I think it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate is all I can say, that we're
Yeah.
not seeing a greater response in our communities around what we're seeing happen in our communities.
Can I go back to I want to just hot flag the
Yeah.
measurement piece here because the federal poverty reduction strategy, right? It's based on these pillars of opportunity and equality for all, and these fairness kinds of principles. But they chose a measurement that only measures basic needs, whereas the low income measure, it is a measure that asks those questions. Does a family living in low income have the same access to opportunity as what we would consider like a normal, Canadian experience? And the example that I use is, can a mother with three children feed her children three healthy meals a day and the snacks and make her rent and pay her utilities and still afford to put her kids in hockey lessons? That's just such a normal Canadian experience. It's not out of the blue. It's nothing asking too much. It's just that kind of, that kind of goal of striving to bring all families up into that goal in that poverty reduction document, they're just not, they don't even have the proper measurement to be able to analyze something like that. So there are these fundamental flaws, I think, in the way the government is really approaching it. I also wanted to just pick up on the pandemic piece. I mean, these rollbacks in both of our charts, our poverty rates are getting so high that we're eroding the progress that the Canada Child Benefit made. So in the
Mm.
national report card, those numbers are now going back up to the same numbers we saw in 2017 when the Canada Child Benefit was implemented. So we're really starting to erode progress that we saw over those years. And the federal government, instead of celebrating the fact that they reached their targets a decade early around poverty reduction strategy and had a program that was accessible and well used and was making meaningful impact in people's lives, instead they have twisted around what happened and have talked about people who have taken the CERB and may need to repay back because the threshold was very particular, and all of um, they're in a process right now of going through and saying, were you really eligible? Give us your documentation 6 years later. And it's really hard for families who are in low income to prove that. And they're being saddled with this debt. And the federal government is framing this as like fraudulent behavior. And it's just, I think that we still are dealing also with the stigma around people who are living in poverty, that these are individual choices, that benefits are being, people are taking advantage of our benefits. And I think part of our work, all of our work, is to reframe the narrative, to really bring this in the systems level to say that, poverty, we've manufactured it through our policies, through our programs, and through our stigmatization of people living in poverty, when actually we need to make this a systems choice and we can eradicate it when we invest in those policies and programs.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add to that. Yeah, yeah, and just going back to where we saw that decrease in Hamilton around after 2016 with the CCB. We're now actually our rate is back to 2015, like even before that. Like we're talk about going backwards.
Yeah.
We're definitely seeing that in Hamilton. We've got about 10 minutes left in our session today. So I would like to open up if anyone has any questions or comments, you can put that in the chat. Questions that might be the easiest way because uh, if there's any questions or comments that you have, I see that Doreen has put something in there in the chat about some work that Dennis Raphael to buy Bryant have a recent paper around there's no interest in implementing these these decades of change of research. I mean, so are there any questions, comments that people have given what you've heard today? I'll open up the floor for any comments or questions. And if the chat, if you get too much difficulty doing that, you can unmute yourself as well and ask your question or provide a comment. And raise your hand just so we can get that. Use the raise hand tool in Zoom there so that we can sort of keep track of that.
Can I just
Oh,
respond to
yes,
Doreen's
go ahead.
question around how do
Yeah,
we fight
sure,
capitalism? I mean,
sure.
I think, hi, first of all, hi, Doreen. And I think that's a
Hi,
great.
Leila. Good to see you again. We need to do a
Yeah, you
podcast
too.
again soon.
Absolutely. Call me anytime. I think this nail on the head with this is such a huge part of the challenge and has been this ongoing fight, right, around capitalism. And I just wanted to promote a great book that I've read recently. Many of you have probably heard of it and read it, but by Matthew Desmond called Poverty. Um, Oh my gosh. Of course, now that I want to say it, the titles escape me, but I'm going to Google it and put it in the chat. Something about how we've created poverty. It's based in America, but there's just so many threads that we can take up. And his whole thing is encouraging people to become in your everyday life a poverty abolitionist. And when we all make these choices in our day-to-day life, we build that movement. And I just think it's such a positive, concrete thing that we can engage in instead of thinking of it as like this big thing that we can't tackle.
Maggie, you've got your hand up.
I just had a comment. I'm sorry I jumped on a little bit late, but I just wanted to thank SPRC for this great report. It was so well done and has, in the work that we do here at the Baby Depot, just giving us again more information, more arsenal to say, hey, this is why we need to, as a community, advocate for the children in our city. So thank you for this discussion. Thank you for the great report and the great work that your team has done to make sure that all of us in the city are knowledgeable and then able to share that information with people and with our donors, with our supporters, to be able to continue to advocate for the children here in Hamilton.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Joey.
Yes, well, I also want to compliment you on this report and Leila on the work that you're doing. And I just want to say how important it is to the kind of grassroots organizing that we're doing in our communities, because you give us the background and the information that allows us to advocate for some of the policy changes or programs. And you just gave me some great ideas. We're now negotiating again with our MPPs and our MP around the early learning and childcare program and the inability of our province and our federal government to support that adequately to build a national program. And we've talked about what that program could mean for children. So there are a couple of your charts, and I'll communicate with both of you that I'm going to use in the next letters, But I have to say, there's something wrong structurally with the people that are elected that can't see the data. And so it's not that they don't see it, they don't want to see it, which I think goes to Doreen's comment. So I hope with this data, there'll be other conversations that we'll all have about the actions that we can take in our communities. I will say one thing to people, and we haven't done this on the poverty file yet, but we did on early learning and childcare here do a petition, which our MP, Karina Gould, read in the House of Commons about 2 weeks ago. So, and it was, of course, advocating for early learning and childcare, the impact on families, on women's access, and certainly the developmental opportunities of our children, our future. So thanks, guys. I think it's tremendous what you've both done.
Thank you. Thank you, Joey, for that.
Mm.
And thank you for the, the information around the petition. I think that's excellent. We need to be engaging our politicians, especially at the federal level with, poverty reduction, but also at our provincial level, because they're all responsible for the well-being of our families and our children and the healthy development of our children in our communities. Really appreciate that. Any other comments or questions? I've got one more thing that I'm going to ask Leila, but I'm going to wait to see if there's any other comments or questions. Well, maybe I'll then pose this question. So, we've talked about engaging our governments. So, if governments, federally, provincially, were to prioritize 3 actions, and I know that you've listed 3 actions over the next 5 years to reduce child poverty, what would they be? What would be those top 3 actions that you think are critical over the next 5 years to really have an impact on child poverty?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think I've got 4.
Okay, I'll let you go with 4.
And I'll do them really, really quickly. So the End Child Poverty Supplement, and that, as I said, is such a quick way to really reduce that stress and give families that income that they need, particularly those marginalized families in deep poverty. The federal government knows who these families are. They have all of their information. They know who is eligible. They know how to get the money to them. They just need to do it, to commit to doing it and get it done. So implementing the End Child Poverty Supplement to the Canada Child Benefit. Joey, you're right on 100% affordable childcare. And I'm not talking $10 a day because those families in deep poverty can't afford $10 a day. We have modeled with the National Child Care Advocates a $0 to $10 a day sliding scale childcare model where families that we are talking about who are in the deepest income, they don't pay anything for their kids to be able to access that childcare. The third one is housing. We need to build affordable housing for these families. We need to make sure that it's accessible for larger families, so larger units, that jobs for the moms and the caregivers are in the neighborhood, childcare is in the neighborhood, green space, quality education, building communities around that affordable long-term affordable housing. And then the fourth one, what I think is really important is work. Families, individuals. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody who's struggling on low income who hasn't been trying to get some kind of work. Not everybody can work full-time all the time, but how are we creating a suite of job opportunities that is decent for people no matter where they are in their life cycle? And so that would be my fourth. And I think that the federal and the provincial and the municipal governments all have a role to play in creating decent work. And then our call to action, we're going into municipal elections. So take this, this knowledge, and anybody knocking on your door trying to get your vote, ask them, what's your plan? What are you going to do to prioritize this and vote with that in mind, the person who is going to implement what you care about?
Wow. Yeah. It seem like no-brainers to me. And
Yeah.
to many of us, I think on this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today to talk about our child and family poverty reports. There's lots of work to be done. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. There is a link in the chat to an evaluation form. If you could kindly fill that out, that would be really appreciated as we plan further webinars. But thank you again, Leila, for joining us in this conversation. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ted. Take care,
Okay.
everybody.
Okay.
Good luck.